How many of you turned your heaters on this weekend? Got one, got John Thinskin Davila back there. Got a few here. You open up some windows. Okay, just shut the air off and open some windows. It is nice that we only have to turn on our heaters 2-3 months for at the most, normally. But it is nice to have some cooler weather. It's affecting me a little bit, my throat. Larry, you may have to preach this morning, okay? All right, good. We are going to continue to look at the Gospels from a large vantage point before we start looking at the ministry of Jesus. On the screen, I think everyone here knows what it's referring to, but this book is going to be our textbook. It's called Amazed by Jesus. It's volume 1. And this morning we're going to be looking at pages 6 through 12 of this book. You don't have to have this. The main book you're going to need as we study is your Bible. That's the main book. But this one is available. If you want a copy, I've got a few up here. We're also going to be talking about a chart, and I'll make that available separately, but it's in the back of the book as well as in the text of the book, and it shows the full ministry of Jesus with all 4 Gospels combined. As we get ready to talk about the Gospels, combining them, I do think it's good for us to think about these individually. I would much prefer to study Matthew in light of Matthew, Mark in light of Mark, Luke in light of Luke. I don't think John wrote his gospel saying, okay, guys, now compare this to Matthew, especially since it's so different. John's gospel is very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those of you who cook, you sometimes throw in a lot of ingredients to make a sauce or something like that, and it reduces, and you put in more volume than you had. That's kind of what we're doing here with the Gospels. We're reducing them, which means we're going to be blurring out a lot of the details so that we can see the big picture of Jesus' 3.5-year ministry. And so we're going to go ahead and get going because we do have a lot of material. We're going to talk about how the Gospels are similar to each other, and then we're also going to talk about how the Gospels are unique just for this session, because as we get into our study over the next several months, we're not going to say, now John's Gospel says this, or Matthew's Gospel says that. We may do that some, but not very much, because we want to see the full picture of Jesus' ministry. I'll make this observation with you as we begin. Luke's Gospel is the longest, and Mark's Gospel is the shortest. In fact, Mark has kind of gotten a short, what's the expression? Shortchanged, because almost every single incident in the Gospel of Mark is repeated in Matthew and Luke. There's just a couple of exceptions. There's a parable and there's a miracle and a couple of sayings of Jesus that aren't elsewhere. So why do we even need Mark? Let's just take Mark's Gospel out and we have pretty much everything. But then we would lose Mark's perspective. We would lose Mark's voice. And it has a unique voice. We'll talk about that a little bit. Matthew and John are pretty comparable, but Luke is the longest of the 4 Gospels. So here's what we're going to look at, how the Gospels are similar, how the Gospels are different. Did I misspell the word similar? S-I-M-I-L. I-A-R, shouldn't that have an I in it? Bummer. Okay, number 1, how the Gospels are similar. They are all narratives. When you start reading Romans or 2 Corinthians, what's the genre of Paul's letters? What are they? They are letters. They're letters. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, they're all narratives. Generally speaking, that's what you've got here. Genre is important. You go watch your Netflix channel or Amazon Prime or whatever. And one way you can sort for something to watch is by genre. What kind of genres are out there for various movies? You got thrillers, you got mysteries, you've got all kinds. And it just depends on what you're looking for. The Gospels are truly unique, but one overriding connection that each gospel has is they are narrative. And what does that mean as opposed to a letter? With Paul's letters, or Peter or whoever, do they have a plot? Well, narratives do. Narratives are driven by a plot, where each scene has a setting, and there is some sort of issue that comes up. There's rising action that leads to a climax. Overall, the entire ministry of Jesus, what is the climax? What is everything leading to in the story, in the narrative about Jesus coming to earth? The death on the cross and the resurrection from the dead. After that, you have what's called the falling action. It's where everything is kind of being sorted out. And finally, you have, I love this word, the denouement. That's fancy, isn't it? The denouement. It's literally the untying of a knot. And we would say something like resolution. Take something like a poem. It's got a little plot. At least it'll help us illustrate this. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. What's the setting? All right, there's a wall, and there's a big, humongous egg sitting on the wall. Can you see that in your mind's eye? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. What's the problem? He fell. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what happens? There's a problem. What if the poem, the little kid's rhyme, was simply Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall? That wouldn't be very exciting, would it? But when he falls, you got a little problem there. And it's got to be resolved. Sitcoms, novels, whatever you're reading, they have problems that must be resolved. One of the sitcoms that my wife and I enjoyed watching was Everybody Loves Raymond, and you have a problem. What were some of the problems that Ray encountered? His mother, and the conflict between his mother and his wife. Something else that caused a lot of problem for Ray is his white lies, as he would probably call them, where he would say, oh, this is why I did such and such, or this is why I have to go and do such and such, but it wasn't true. And the rest of the show is about what? Him trying to fix it or continue to cover it up. And you can see that as an exciting drama. Funny things happen, and all these things connect and interconnect. And the same kind of thing happens in the Gospels. You don't think of it as literature. This is the Word of God, and that's true. But it's literature. God is communicating to us using conventions that we are going to be familiar with. And it all started not with the New Testament, but with the Old Testament. We have stories, we have narratives all throughout Scripture. Now, when I start referring to the Abraham story, Genesis 12, does that mean it's fictional? Is that the same thing as saying, oh, Abraham wasn't real, Jesus wasn't real? Well, absolutely not. This is true narrative. These things really happened, and the way they're being presented to us shapes our interpretation. It's going to help us. If you think about the New Testament, we said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all narratives. They have plot. And the person who really developed and wrote down scientifically how plot works was Aristotle. And in his book Poetics. This is something that's been observed for millennia, and this is how it works. Take Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast. What's the setting? You got this awkward young lady who is the daughter of some guy who runs into some issues, and he ends up sending his daughter to go live with a beast, and next thing you know, there's a real problem there. Beauty and the Beast, she has to interact with this really mean, ugly, awful person. And people don't like the beast, and they want to hurt the beast. And eventually, there's a resolution or a climax when the bad guys realize, hey, this is a real person, and what's the resolution? They live happily ever after. This happens all the time in our movies, in our books, in our novels, even in our Bibles. By the way, in the New Testament, there is one other book that is a narrative. So if we've already talked about the Gospels and the book of Acts, and we're saying the letters are not narrative, what's left? Revelation has characters. It has setting. It has plot. It is a narrative. It is an apocalyptic narrative, but it is telling a story nonetheless. And that helps us in our study of that book, just to be able to get caught up in the story. And I hope that will help us a little bit as we think about the Gospels, that this is not too foreign. We are familiar already with how these books work. However, there are other subgenres in the Gospels. What are some of those subgenres? Parables. There are miracles. Jesus is portrayed as the hero. If Jesus is the protagonist, he is the de facto protagonist in the Gospels. Who are the antagonists? Who are the bad guys? Satan. The Pharisees, the religious leaders in general, Pharisees, Sadducees, elders, Herodians, that group. Who else acts as antagonists to Jesus? The Romans, the Roman Empire. Somebody else, some other group, sometimes acts as antagonists. His own disciples, Peter, especially in Mark's gospel. Do you realize that Mark's gospel has hardly anything good to say about the apostles? Who are some of the people that are praised by Jesus in the Gospels that you wouldn't expect to have been praised by our Lord? What ethnic group? The Good Samaritan, Gentiles in general. Who are supposed to be the people to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior? The Jews. And many of them rejected Jesus. It was the Gentiles, a lot of them, individuals who saw who Jesus was, and they were drawn to him. And that's another theme, where how Jesus is rejected, and that's the conflict that moves the plot along, not just in individual incidents. For example, when Jesus heals a man of his inability to walk, he's brought down through the roof. There's a conflict right there. There's some rising action. Wow, this is really interesting how it's developing. And what does Jesus say to the man who was let down through the roof? What does he say to him at first? Your sins are forgiven. Did that create conflict? Right then and there. And what is the resolution? What is the climax, I should say? When Jesus says to him, take up your bed and walk. And everybody's saying, who can forgive sin but God alone? And what's the answer? He's God. He can forgive sin. And that was very important to Jesus. That's something for us to think about as we go through these Gospels. And we're going to be looking for characters, how setting will influence the scenes, the action that is taking place. It will actually serve as a backdrop for interpretation. All right, something else I want to talk about is how the Gospels are similar in regard to their overemphasis on the last week of Jesus' life. And I hope this is something you've already seen, or as we talk about it, you go, oh yeah, of course, I get that. How long was Jesus' ministry? We say about 3 years, 3.5 years. If you read just Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you would think it was a little more than a year. It focuses on the Galilean ministry of Jesus. John's gospel helps us to see it was a longer period of time, about 3.5 years. However, the gospels focus on the passion of Jesus. When he enters Jerusalem on Sunday, he is crucified the following Friday, I will contend, and then the following Sunday is raised from the dead. So a week. That's called the Passion Week. The Passion Week referring to Jesus' suffering. How much of Matthew focuses on that last week? Percentage-wise, 35% of the Gospel of Matthew looks at 1 week in Jesus' life. That's a bit lopsided, isn't it? So if you took the Gospel of Matthew and held up all the pages and then said, all right, I'm going to separate chapters 21 through 28, where Jesus makes his triumphal entry. And I'm including the last 40 days because during the period after the ascension, he makes his post-resurrection appearances. Mark's Gospel, 37%, based on the word count of Mark 1 through 10, and then comparing that to Mark 11 through 16. 37% of the Gospel of Mark focuses on basically the last week of Jesus' life. It barely touches the post-resurrection. Barely. Luke's Gospel, lower percentage. And remember, Luke is the longest of the 4 Gospels, and he has a lot of parables that the other Gospels don't have. There quite a bit of material that is not covered in the others, interestingly. But then here is John's Gospel, 42%. The first 12 chapters focus on Jesus' ministry. Chapters 13 through 21 focus on this last week of Jesus' life, the last 40 days. What does that tell you about the Gospels? Their purpose. Are they just trying to tell us about Jesus and say he was a good guy? The focus is on his death, burial, resurrection, and glorification, his ascension. What about all this other stuff? So we're looking at Matthew. What about the other 65%? Is it important? We need to talk about the other 65%, keeping in mind that it's all leading to a climax. It's all leading to Jesus' last week. That's important as we begin to synthesize, to reduce all the Gospels into one narrative, so to speak. All right, and then I also want to emphasize how they use similar language. You might have heard of a term called the synoptic problem. That's kind of an older term now that I grew up with. The synoptic Gospels. What are the synoptic Gospels? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What does that mean? As opposed to John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are grouped together, and they're referred to very often as the synoptic Gospels. Why? Because they have a lot of similarities with each other, and John is so different than the other 3. And we'll see some of that, I hope, as we go. But just take a look at one verse in particular. Here's Matthew 22, verse 28, in comparison with Mark 12, verse 23, in comparison with Luke 20, verse 33. And this is in the material on page 9. Can you see the similarities? In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. For the 7 had her as wife. For the 7 had her as wife. Why are these Gospels so similar to each other? Why do they use a lot of the same kind of language? This is just one little example.
They were all together. They probably thought similar. They had similar thoughts.
Okay.
And they're all inspired as well.
They're all inspired. They're all inspired. And are they writing about different incidents here? I mean, we say Matthew 22, that's one passage. Mark 12 is another passage. But it's the same incident, so that's a factor. These men are inspired. Luke and Mark were not there on the occasion. Mark may have been, in that he was a follower of Jesus, but we're not told specifically. Mark wrote his gospel in close connection with Peter. We mentioned that last week, so there may be something to that. But ultimately, what you have is 3 points of view that are talking about the same events. Is there going to be some overlap? Absolutely. But they're also going to tell the same incidents similarly. I'm going to give you another example here. Remember how I mentioned that Mark's gospel is the shortest, and we just want to, sometimes we might be tempted to think, well, we don't really need to study Mark because everything's repeated except for, just a little bit. Everything's repeated in Matthew and Luke that's mentioned in Mark. What's amazing is that Mark may be shorter, but whenever it has an account of a particular incident mentioned in Matthew and Luke, Mark's gospel will mention details that neither do. And that is truly unique about Mark. So is it a man with an unclean spirit who comes out of the tombs and meets Jesus at Gadarene or Gerasa? According to Mark's gospel, it's one man. According to Matthew and Luke, according to Luke also, it's a man, so a single man. 2 demon-possessed men, according to Matthew's account. And this is where you have the problem in synoptic problem arise. Wait a minute. Can Mark and Luke just not count? Or is Matthew making it up that there were 2 people? How can we have 2 accounts say there was one man and 1 account say that there were 2 men? It's obviously a contradiction. I got some heads going this way. Why do you say, no, it's not necessarily a contradiction? Why not? Okay. Now, Mark and Luke would have possibly known about the other person. I'm sure they did. But who are they emphasizing? The leader of the 2, Legion, as he's called. Something else we need to think about is the Gospels are not written to 21st century Americans. They're not written using the standards that we want to foist upon literature. They're not going to have any problems with paraphrasing. And so we think, well, it should be a direct quote. It should be exactly word for word what Jesus said. And it's apparent when you look at some of the parallels, it's not exactly the same. Matthew is topically arranged at times, not chronologically. You have a problem with that? This is supposed to be chronological. Well, who said? Who makes those rules? Matthew, it is apparent, as it's compared with Mark and Luke and John, it's not always chronological. Mark and Luke and John are more so chronological, but not strictly. So that's something for us to think about. I'm going to throw this one up here. Mark 5, talking about the Gerasene demoniac. Look at all that highlighted text in Mark's account. None of it is in Matthew and Luke's accounts of Legion, the demon-possessed man. Yes, I got 2 hands over here. Well, let me get her back there. Of the 3 men, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right, Mark is filling in some details that the others simply do not have. On page 5, I've got a little sidebar that says Peter's Gospel. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered. This is from Eusebius, the first church historian, and he was writing in I think the 3rd century. Let's see. Mark, we know from 2 Peter, was a close associate of the Apostle Peter. And it is surmised by these early Christians that Mark wrote his gospel in large part based on the inspired testimony of Peter. We don't know that for sure. The Bible doesn't say that. And so whenever we start talking about, well, who was an eyewitness and who wasn't, Mark's writing probably relies heavily on Peter, who was an eyewitness. But then these men are inspired by God. they're going to write details. And so Mark may be the shortest, and yet he has a ton of extra information from time to time. Yes, sir.
Well, I was going to point out, so I don't believe that these contradict each other. And yet, depending on how you personally view the process of inspiration, these may contradict your views of inspiration, depending on how strictly you believe God's hand plays the writing of these texts.
So in Luke's prologue, he says, I have done meticulous research. Luke was not an eyewitness, and yet he says, now let me tell you, other people have written, but I am writing after doing a lot of research. And Luke's gospel tells us a lot about the inner thoughts of Mary. What's to stop Luke, as a historian, to go to Mary and say, Mary, did you know? Mary, what do you think? Tell me what your thoughts are here. What would be wrong with that? I don't want to minimize inspiration. Did Matthew, Mark, and Luke just fall into a trance and say, oh, yeah, Jesus went here, and then he went there, and then, oh, look what I wrote. Look at that. Is that the presentation of inspiration in Scripture? No, it's not. And there's a lot that could be said about that. And it's an important topic, inspiration. The fact is we have 4 Gospels, and they do have a lot of similarities. They also have some interesting ways of talking about the same incidents. And I just wanted to highlight that as we begin our study. All right, I'm going to go on to our next topic, and that is how the Gospels are unique. So we've talked about how they are similar. I got to correct that. Similar. Oh, it is correct. Boy, I tell you, I'm looking at that saying, is that? So I was right, but I was wrong, so I'm right. Good, got it. I asked my dad one time, says, Dad, are you ever wrong? And he says, well, one time I thought I was wrong, but I was right, so I was wrong. Unfortunately, I've been wrong a lot. And of course, he was joking. How are the Gospels unique? So we've kind of thrown them together a little bit. Let's talk about, just for a moment, because we're not going to be looking at this. We're not going to be dwelling on this for the next several months. Let's talk for a moment about how each gospel is a little unique. I'll tell you something here. As Matthew begins his gospel, the angel appears to Mary. Gabriel appears to Mary and says his name, your divine son, is going to be named Emmanuel, which means God is with us. That's Matthew 1. In Matthew 28, Jesus says to his disciples, and lo, I am with you always. And that kind of binds the whole gospel together, where Jesus says that it's said of Jesus, I am with you. And then at the end of the gospel, I am with you always. The way Matthew's gospel is presented, I said it's topical, and Mark and Luke and John too, are more chronological. But Matthew's gospel is alternates between a narrative and a discourse. A narrative and a discourse. So the first 4 chapters of Matthew are narrative, but then what happens in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7? What does Jesus do in Matthew 5 through 7? He gives the Sermon on the Mount. It's supposed to be an easy layup there. Yeah, the Sermon on the Mount. When I was a kid, I had a red letter edition of the Bible, and I would look at Matthew's gospel, and I would see these large sections of red text, which means those words are more holy than all the others because they're in red. Yeah, that's kind of why they did away with that Bible publishers. It's not Jesus' words are not more important than the other passages, but it is interesting, isn't it, to see the words that Jesus spoke in red letters scattered throughout the New Testament. Matthew 5 through 7, red, red, red. Matthew 10, red. Matthew 13, red text. Matthew 18, red text. Matthew chapters 23 through 25, red text. Now, there's some red text, obviously, in chapters 8 and 9, where Jesus is talking, but it's also about Jesus, stories about Jesus, about his healing and interacting with demons, especially, and and performing miracles. That's how Matthew's gospel is structured. All along, there's conflict. And that's especially found in the narratives, where you have the religious leaders who are opposing Jesus. We'll see that as we get into our lessons. But this is how Matthew's gospel is arranged. 5 major discourses. Some have suggested this is intended to reflect the 5 books of Moses. I don't know. But that might be an easy way to remember. Oh yeah, there are 5 major sections. And something that is interesting about these 5 major sections is that each of them ends. But why don't we take a look real quick in Matthew 7, verse 28. I didn't put this on the screen. I'll just read these to you. And it's in the material on page 10. Matthew 7, verse 28. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. Matthew chapter 11, verse 1. After chapter 10, the discourse in chapter 10, Matthew chapter 11, verse 1 says, when Jesus had finished instructing. You go on to Matthew chapter 13, the end of that sermon, Matthew 13, the parables, when Jesus had finished these parables. So there's a pattern here. When Jesus had finished, when Jesus had finished, when Jesus had finished. Are we going to see it again? You bet. After chapter 18, verse 19, when Jesus had finished these sayings, and then the narrative resumes. And then there's one last in Matthew 26, after the Olivet Discourse, as it's called. Matthew 26, verse 1 says, when Jesus had finished all these sayings. And so the gospel is signaling to us, we're done looking at Jesus' narratives. Chapters 26, 27, and 28 are discourses. We're done looking at the discourses. We're now moving on to narrative. When Jesus had finished, when Jesus had finished, when Jesus had finished, when Jesus had finished, when Jesus had finished all these sayings. That's useful when we're studying Matthew's gospel, to appreciate his unique structure. Take a look at Mark 1, as we now talk about Mark's gospel for just a moment. Mark chapter 1. Mark 1 verse 1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And I think this verse provides us a simple outline to the gospel of Mark. Look at Mark chapter 8. Mark chapters 1 through 8 are the first half of the gospel of Mark. That works well, doesn't it? Half of 16 is 8. So Mark chapters 1 through 8 are the first major section. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In Mark 8, verses 27 through 30, what does Peter say about Jesus? Who do men say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. There it is in Mark 8, verse 29. The gospel of Jesus Christ. You don't have the term Christ used very often in the gospel of Mark. This is the first human to refer to Jesus as the Christ in the gospel of Mark. It's everywhere in Matthew and Luke, but not necessarily in Mark's gospel. And then there is a reference to the Son of God in Mark 15. So you have the gospel of Jesus Christ, Mark 1 through 8, the Son of God. And who is it in Mark 15 who declares Jesus to be the Son of God in verse 39? Truly this man was the Son of God. The Roman centurion who took part in executing Jesus. Is that something Mark intends for us to see? I think so. Mark 1 through 8, Mark 9 through 16. Those are the two major parts. And when you read Mark 8, and of course, Mark didn't have chapter numbers. He didn't say this is Mark 1 through 8, this is Mark 9 through 16. But this has been observed after the chapters were made and said, all right, this is the part where they are. There's a strong emphasis on people's reaction to Jesus, amazed by Jesus. That's where this comes from, really. All the Gospels emphasize how Jesus amazed crowds, but that is especially true of Mark's Gospel. They were amazed, they were fearful, they marveled. It's just emphasized over and over again. There's also this adverb, immediately, that occurs a lot. We're not going to take the time to look at that, but it drives the narrative forward. And immediately Jesus did this, and immediately that happened, and immediately that happened. And the King James famously used different terms to describe this same adverb: straightway, forthwith, immediately. But I think it's important to see that you've got this word. I don't think it's systematic per se. I think it's just a general characteristic of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel, turn to Mark 6. Mark's gospel emphasizes the emotions of Jesus. A lot of times when I was a kid, the portrayals I saw of Jesus were he was always very stoic. That was the idea I had in my head. Jesus walks around, he's got long flowing hair, just like Jeremy and I dream about. And he's soft-spoken. And well, take a look at Mark 6. It's the Sabbath. There's a man there with a withered hand, and you got the religious leaders who are eyeing Jesus. Let's see if he heals that man on the Sabbath. Can't believe he might do that. And what did I do here? Mark 3. I'm remembering wrong. Mark 3. Yes, Mark 3, 1 through 6. I'm getting old, and I'm starting to forget things. Mark 3. So there's a man with a withered hand, and people are watching Jesus so they might accuse him in verse 2. Verse 4. He said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, or to save or to kill?" They kept silent. Verse 5. He looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. The other accounts, Matthew 12 and Luke 6, do not mention Jesus' anger. Mark's gospel emphasizes the emotions of Jesus. That's not to say the others don't as well at times, but Mark especially does. And I guess I already talked about this, the two basic parts of Mark's gospel. Luke's gospel, longer than the others. Luke is the only gospel to have a companion volume. Why is that important? Well, it's especially important for our future study of Acts, because Luke and Acts have a lot of connections between each other. Matthew, Mark, and John, they don't have companion volumes. Only Luke's gospel does. And that's something to keep in mind. There are a lot of parables in Luke's gospel that are not recorded in the others. Can you think of some that are unique to Luke? That if we didn't have Luke's gospel, we would not have the parable of the Good Samaritan. Can you imagine? It's the only gospel that records it. The prodigal son, only recorded in Luke 15. There's an emphasis in the Gospel of Luke on all the women who were involved in Jesus' ministry. Why was that important, especially in the first century patriarchal dominated world? He places women on a pedestal. Paul, when he starts writing his material by inspiration, he does the same thing. He places women on a pedestal. All the gospel writers do, but especially the Gospel of Luke. That is a prominent theme. He goes out of his way. Every time Luke has an example of someone who did something, there is a parallel example of a woman doing it too. Remember in Luke 1, Luke 2, when Jesus is presented at the temple, you've got this man Simeon, this older man Simeon, who embraces Jesus as a baby. He's just an 8-day-old baby, and they're so excited. I guess it was at his presentation in the temple. And who is that countered by? There's this woman, and her name was Anna, and she was there as well. And you've got a lot of this throughout the Gospel of Luke. Luke has a unique section. It's called Luke's central section. And it starts, in the middle it says the same thing, and at the end it says, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. Boy, it takes him a long time to get to Jerusalem. and it has a lot of teaching from Jesus, a lot of material. That's a unique presentation in Luke's gospel, and that's topical, a large part. I'm hurrying a little bit. I'm just trying. I don't even want you to. I'm hoping you're not writing all this down. It's in the material what we're talking about, but I just wanted to give you a taste. John's gospel, and in fact, I'm hoping much of this is just a reminder. We said Matthew's gospel was divided by 5 narratives. What about John's gospel? There's 2 sets of 7 in John's gospel. There are 7 signs, and I've listed them here on the screen. They're also in the material. Jesus' first sign was turning water to wine when he healed the soldiers, or not the soldier, the nobleman's son from a distance at the end of John chapter 4. He heals the paralytic, feeds the 5,000, walks on the water as he crosses the Sea of Galilee. The blind man receives sight. The blind mind. I must be talking about me. Just did something wrong there, typing. And then Lazarus raised. Notice that these signs are covered in the first 11 chapters. John's gospel is often is divided into 2 parts. Chapters 1 through 12, and then chapters 13 through 21, where Jesus focuses on the last week of his life. The first 12 chapters are called the book of signs. And it's for this reason, because you've got 7 signs. John starts counting them in Luke 2 and then Luke 4. This is the first sign that Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. This is the second sign. He stops counting, but what you see is 7 signs, and that's balanced with 7 sayings of Jesus. And they do cross into the second half. But the first one appears in John 6, where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. In John 8 and 9, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. John 10, I am the door of the sheep. Close connection with that one. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life, he tells Martha in John 11. I am the way, the truth, and the life. In John 14, he says to his apostles, I am the true vine, to that same audience. I am. What is Jesus channeling there? What is he referring to when he says, I am the bread of life? I am the resurrection and the life. His deity, explain that to me. You're right, he is referring to his deity in a very special way. The I am is God. The I am is God as presented in Exodus 3. Jesus is using that same language. And I think I mentioned this in a Bible class one time. You see it a lot. You see that this little expression, I am, and sometimes it's obscured in our English translations. But when in Luke 9, there I go again. In John 9, when the blind mind is healed, the blind man. When the blind man is healed, they're asking him, are you really that blind man? Are you that blind man? And his answer was, I am. And I think what John, and there are other reasons why I would say this, but John is trying to signal to us is this man's faith is growing and he's becoming a little Jesus. He's becoming like Jesus. Not that he's deity, but that he is talking like Jesus. And that's an interesting idea. Maybe he just said, I am. I don't think so. I think there's more to it. When Jesus is asked by Caiaphas, are you the Son of God or not? And Jesus says, it is as you say. And part of that answer is, I am. It is true what you're saying here. John's gospel is unique. What's that term we use for Matthew, Mark, and Luke together? They're often referred to as the synoptic gospels, seen together, seen with the eye together. Synoptic, that's all that word means, seen together. John's gospel is so unique and different. It's otherworldly is how I would describe it. Matthew and Luke, what do they begin with? What event in Jesus' life do they start with? His birth. Now Mark, full-grown Jesus, let's go. I'm starting my Galilean ministry, let's go. John's gospel doesn't start with a full-grown Jesus. It doesn't start with a baby Jesus or still in the womb Jesus. It begins with creation. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. John 1, verse 1. Isn't that amazing? John's gospel is very different in that regard. Oh, I didn't highlight these. Okay. John's gospel, unlike the synoptics, does not focus on the great Galilean ministry. As we go through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're going to see a big focus on about a year and a half, a little less than a year and a half of Jesus in Galilee. That's where he started his ministry. Makes sense, though, because where was he from? What region? Galilee. He was from Nazareth of Galilee, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But John's gospel is where we're going to start in a couple of weeks, because he talks about events before the Galilean ministry that the others do not talk about. I am out of time. I was watching the clock, doing good, and I said, oh no, I just realized I'm out of time. Folks, next Sunday, we're going to continue a short introduction, but we are going to start getting into the text of the Gospels. However, on Sunday nights, what we're doing is something special, and that is we're going to take some aspect of what we've looked at this morning, and we're going to apply it. And I'm excited because Larry's going to be back in the fold. He was out of town last week. I had to do it. And this was really special. And I hope you can come back this evening as we talk about sharing our faith with others. That's what these gospel writers did. They wrote the 4 gospels so that we may know about Jesus, so that we may have faith in Jesus. And we're going to try to apply that concept in our own lives tonight. Sunday morning, a little more technical. Sunday night, practical. And I appreciate so much your participation this morning. Hope this has been helpful.